Okay, good. Welcome, everyone. This is our first class of the second part of Chapter 9, and we'll also do Chapter 10, the dedication chapter of Shantideva's text. Let's go ahead and start with some prayers. As usual, we'll recite the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times. We'll go on to do the mandala offering, and then finally refuge in Bodhichitta, which we'll do once in English, twice in the Tibetan. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Just realized I pulled up the prayers from one of the other series of classes I'm doing and not the ones that we normally use for this course. That's okay. If they're the same prayers, I think, just a different format. Okay, so the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. And then finally, refuge in Bodhichitta, again, once in English, the other 2 times in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Okay, let's do a short meditation then. Again, just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath in whatever way suits your mind, allowing the mind to settle a bit, let go of whatever distractions you have from the day. Then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to strengthen our bodhicitta motivation before we begin. So now let's do a short reflection on Bodhichitta so that we bring the ideal motivation to our time together this evening. And recall how the root of Bodhichitta is compassion. And when we study these teachings on emptiness, as we've been doing in the first part of this course on Chapter 9, we should become even more compassionate towards others, as well as towards ourselves. When we see all the unnecessary pain and suffering that has arisen due to this error, is adhering to things and ourselves as inherently existent. If we weren't making that mistake, if others weren't making that mistake, we wouldn't suffer at all. We wouldn't be clinging to this independent self that we protect to such a great degree and engage in so many unwholesome actions on the basis of believing in that self. And others are doing the same. And most beings, by far, don't even know that they're making this mistake. So when we come to these teachings on emptiness, it should be united with that compassion that understands that why we have to know this truth very deeply is not just for our own sake, not just to have an end to our own suffering, but so that we can help others to do the same. As we've seen in the last course, if we don't realize emptiness, if we don't develop that perfection of wisdom, there's no way we can be liberated and achieve enlightenment. So it's so essential that we engage in these teachings with the best motivation, the motivation to benefit all beings. Through our own development of this wisdom, may we become perfect Buddhas. May we be able to then help others to do the same. This is our motivation for being here. And just let that settle into your heart very strongly. Okay, wonderful. So again, this is the second part of the course. Before I get started, I did want to just acknowledge and show my appreciation for the offerings that were made by many students, as well as from the centers from the previous course. It's very much appreciated. So just know that I wanted to express that since I didn't have a chance to say a lot to any of you after that last course. So we've had a little bit of a break. Hopefully you've been able to keep your meditation on emptiness and other studies to going through the time that we were apart. Let's get grounded back in where we were in terms of the text, and I am going to do a brief review. I'm not going to do all the normal things I do at the beginning of a course like this, like talking about the basic program and all that. I'm assuming everybody has been here and heard all of that. But I will do a brief review of Chapter 9 so far, what we covered in the first part of this up through verse 77. Again, I won't be going through all the verses, just touch on a few of them that express some of the key ideas that we've already encountered. And then we'll continue tonight with verse 78 and go forward as far as we can. Whoops, hit the wrong one. There we go. Okay, no, that is right. Here's the review. Okay, so again, we're two main outlines to this chapter according to Gyaltsep Je's headings. The explanation of the title will come at the very end, and it's very brief. The bulk of it are the 167 verses in this chapter. That's divided into three parts. The first part was just one verse, and we'll look at that verse in just a moment, showing that those wishing to attain, let me go to the, make sure I say the title correctly, those wishing to attain liberation need to generate the wisdom, realizing suchness. Of course, in liberation, that includes enlightenment. But as I was saying in the motivation tonight, we absolutely have to realize emptiness in order to accomplish that. The section that we're still in is the second part of this, the method of how to generate the wisdom realizing suchness, and we'll get into that outline shortly. And then we end at the tail end of this discussion of Chapter 9, whenever that happens this term, we'll look at the advice that it is suitable to strive in realizing emptiness from Shantideva. So this is the very first verse of this chapter. The Muni, Buddha, taught all these branches for the purpose of wisdom. So everything else that we've studied so far, all of the other teachings on the other perfections, perfection of generosity, which isn't really there in terms of a full chapter, the perfection of morality, of patience, joyous effort and concentration, all these things we've studied previously in this course, all of these were taught for the purpose of developing wisdom. And they even went through some analogies that show that they're really blind without wisdom. We can engage in those practices, but we never achieve the final result without wisdom. Therefore, those who desire to pacify suffering should generate wisdom. So again, I'm not going to say much more about this, but that was just the way of leading us into this, to recognize that it is absolutely essential that if we want to pacify our own suffering, or if we want to be an agent of pacifying the suffering of others, we have to generate the wisdom realizing emptiness. I am going to touch on the two selflessnesses because we are going to go into the second of these two that we discussed, the selflessness of persons, in the first course. This is a repeat of some of the slides we had towards the beginning of the last course. This is from the Master's Program Middle Way Study Manual. If one doesn't realize the mental and physical aggregates as not truly existing, meaning again by aggregates, they're the basis for the person, the body, the mind, all the various parts of those, one cannot realize that the person who is imputed in dependence on the aggregates does not truly exist. And thus one will not realize the selflessness of person. So when we talk about selflessness, these two selflessnesses, as we're going to see, there's really no differentiation between what they are negating. They're negating the idea of things having an autonomous, self-existent identity. Things lack that, whether we talk about the person or whether we talk about other phenomena, computers, dogs, whatever. I mean, any phenomenon that we observe, we can see that it lacks inherent existence in the same way that we do. But in that passage, it's showing that if we don't realize both the selflessness of phenomena that are the basis for the person, the body, and so on, as well as the person, then we haven't realized it fully. There are, again, some coarser views of selflessness of persons that are taught in the other Buddhist traditions, and they're also, of course, upheld by the tradition we're studying, which again is the Consequence Middle Way School, Prasangika Madhyamaka. But just know that, again, without realizing correctly the selflessness of both of these, we don't have that perfect view. We don't have the ability to generate the actual antidote to our ignorance and remove it. So let's go on and look at a little bit more on these two selflessnesses. So just as the lack of true existence or inherent existence with respect to phenomena, such as the aggregates, is posited as the selflessness of phenomena, in the same way, the lack of a truly existent person is posited as the selflessness of person. So again, phenomena is usually referred to as phenomena other than person, and then person, of course, includes people, ourselves, other beings, other people. Without eliminating this conception, it is impossible to abandon the afflictive obscurations. This is the reason that the conception of self of phenomena and the conception of self of persons are posited as afflictive obscurations. And the afflictive obscurations for Prasangika Madhyamaka are that ignorance, as well as all of what arises on the basis of that ignorance, that misconception of how everything exists. And again, the footnote on there, afflictive obscurations mainly block you yourself from achieving your individual liberation, as opposed to the knowledge obscurations, which mainly block the attainment of omniscience. So again, we do have to realize the full selflessness of both persons and phenomena to remove just the afflictive obscurations. And we also, of course, need that to remove the knowledge obscurations. But simply just to attain liberation, we need that wisdom. So the two selflessnesses, as I just indicated a short while ago, are not divided by way of the object of negation, as the object of negation for both selflessnesses is inherent existence, is the idea that things are able to stand on their own, establish themselves from their own side, but rather by way of having a different substratum. The substratum for selflessness of persons is, of course, persons, ourselves and other people, and for phenomena is anything else other than a person. And it's the same, emptiness that is being generated. Then the lack of inherent existence is just with regard to what basis or what substratum. In order to abandon the conception of a self, one has to realize selflessness. And in order to realize selflessness, one has to realize the non-existence of the referent object of the conception of self, the inherently existent self. So again, the idea behind this is that we have a false conception. That conception is holding things to exist in this inherently existent way. That doesn't exist at all. We've had like believing in a fake object. Remember the analogy of a dream. When you're dreaming and you're really convinced of the reality of that dream, you are believing those dream objects have a status that is equal to objects outside of the dream. And so then when you wake up, you can, that all disappears because that false object that you were adhering to in your dream state of things having that level of reality we have seen doesn't exist at all. It's similar with regard, not identical, but similar with regard to what we're dealing with all the time. We are believing in a fictitious world, a fictitious idea about everything and ourselves. And when we are able to remove that, then we are able to overcome that misconception. But we have to negate that idea that's being held to. Just like the dream objects are held to be real by our dreaming mind, in the waking life, our everyday objects are held to be real by our ignorance. So it's a very similar concept. Okay, just a little bit more on this, and then we'll move on to summarizing the rest of this first part. From the point of view of realizing the two selflessnesses, one first realizes the selflessness of persons, and this is how Shantideva presented it. We went into that at the tail end of the last class. And then our last course, then the selflessness of phenomena, which is where we're going to pick up tonight at the very beginning. We're going right into the selflessness of phenomena other than persons. Lama Tsongkhapa says that they are realized in this order because it is easier to identify the substratum of the selflessness of persons than to identify the substratum of the selflessness of phenomena. We can see that more easily, and that there is a level of imputation involved in the self that we may not be able to see as clearly with things other than the self. Why is this? When the person is realized, it is realized to depend upon the aggregates. If we talk about any particular person, such as, I don't know, I could say President Biden, so when we think of President Biden, immediately what comes to our minds are his aggregates, his form aggregate generally, that we don't know his mind directly, but we know there's a mind there, a consciousness there. But, that is what appears to us. We see that we have a level of dependence upon the aggregates, the physical and mental basis for a person in order for the person to appear or to be realized. So this continues, understanding that the person depends on the aggregates. One understands that the person does not exist independent from the aggregates, and that the person is merely imputed by conception. And of course, if we really take it to its conclusion, that's where we go in terms of realizing the emptiness of the person. But again, this is still just pointing us in the way of emptiness, but we have to actually get to that place where we see that there is no independently existent person at all. After one has realized the selflessness of persons, one does not have to apply further reasonings in order to realize the selflessness of phenomena. Merely by focusing on an object and applying the same reasoning, the emptiness of that object will be realized. And this is actually where we're going to start tonight, is when we go into looking at what are called the foreclosed placements of mindfulness, and we start with the body. We're returning back to the body, but we're not going to go through all of the vile substances of the body and all that like we've done 1,000 times, it seems, in Shantideva. Instead, we're going to be looking at the emptiness of the body. And we use the same sort of logic that we use for the self. Can we find something in the parts of the body that is equivalent to the body? In the same way that we looked at the parts of the self that are the basis for the self, the mind and the body, and is there a real self there? So it's a very similar logic that we use. Now, having said that, and having put that slide up there, do know that part of this chapter, the rest of this chapter, will be to look at some additional reasonings that are kind of different approaches to look at emptiness and how to develop that awareness. So know that we aren't going to just stay with that same way that we looked at the person. We're going to add some additional analyses, some additional reasonings that get at how things are produced and so on. Kind of some interesting things to noodle over. So then we started the second section that we again are still in, the method of how to generate the wisdom realizing suchness, which began with verse 2, continues through verse 150. We have, that divided into 3 parts. The first part had to do with the presentation of the 2 truths that I'll touch on very briefly now. And then the second part, establishing that even just to attain liberation, one needs to realize emptiness, which again, I'll just touch on briefly, and then get into the explaining extensively the reasoning establishing emptiness, which is divided into the 2, selflessness of persons and selflessness of phenomena. So the two truths. We have verse 2, the concealer or conventional and the ultimate are asserted to be the two truths. The ultimate is not an object of utilization of the mind. The mind is said to be a concealer. So again, I'm not going to put up any other slides for this. Let me just talk about it very briefly. So with any phenomenon, such as my mala here, this that we call a mala, we see that it has a conventional nature, which is being merely imputed or designated by the mind. That's how it exists in the end. But when we establish things such as malas, computers, people, what have you, we establish them together with our ignorant mind, with some concealment with regard to the real nature of those things. Because our ignorance is always establishing those things and grasping at them as inherently existent. So everything that we've established in the world through our conventional nominal designation of things exists in this very subtle way, but we don't even realize that, because once we name something, it appears to be that from its own side. That's that subtler obscuration to knowledge. And then we grasp at that as if it were real. And so this is what's going on with all beings and ourselves. And we have to begin by undermining the ignorance that is grasping at this. Eventually, we can get rid of that false appearance as well. But the two truths, the conventional truth is pointing to the way things are established through this ignorance that is really simply designated, simply nominally existent. There are no real objects existing from their own side. There's only what we decide to call mala, wrist mala, or what we decide to call book or computer or person, whatever. So all of these phenomena are merely designated. This is the final way that we kind of come to understand conventional truths, but that's by way of understanding ultimate truth, that things lack any independent existence. So any phenomenon that we establish through our naming it exists together with its emptiness. It exists together with its lack of inherent existence. So there is this inseparability of the emptiness of mala and mala, and they're both established together. And what I'm holding in my hand, because it's empty of inherent existence, isn't a real mala. There is no real mala here in my hand. There's just the parts of a mala that are the basis of designation for the term mala. Its ultimate nature is lacking anything more than that, any substantial existence whatsoever. So again, these two exist together, inextricably bound up in everything that we establish. So the I has a conventional nature, a conventional truth about it, merely labeled mere I, and then an emptiness of the I. These two exist together. And as long as I exists, the emptiness of I exists. So this is, again, pointing to the two truths, which we are going to touch on a little bit in the second part as well, not as extensively in going into what we did with the first part, but we will be talking about how this is once more upheld within this view of selflessness. Then the second part that we looked at, establishing that even just to attain liberation, one needs to realize emptiness. Here we had two lines to start that with that said, by seeing the truths, one will be freed. What is the use of seeing empties? The truths here aren't the two truths that we just talked about. It's the Four Noble Truths. And recall this section, it had to do with the fact that some of the lower schools of Buddhism say that all one needs to do is realize the 16 attributes or aspects of the Four Noble Truths, which I'm not going to, again, go into in all detail, but included in that are once more these coarser views of emptiness that, according to some of the lower schools, you can become liberated on the basis of that alone. Remember, we had those two views of a person in particular. The coarsest one is the idea that there's some sort of unitary, independent, permanent, unchanging I. That is essentially what's taught in the Vedic traditions, the idea of an Atman or a soul. And this is a learned tenet. It's acquired intellectually through our being exposed to people who believe in these sorts of things, and they indoctrinated us into them, and then we start believing that there is this thing called a soul that exists, that is somewhat independent of causes and conditions and has its own sort of autonomous entity, but is unchanging. Very kind of strange view of the self, but Buddhism refutes this self and says no such thing exists. We cannot find a basis for it. It's an acquired tenet. Again, it's not something that we innately have from life to life, but it does need to be removed for many people because we do acquire this false view. The other one that's a little bit subtler, but is not the subtlest view of emptiness we've been talking about, is that view of a lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. This is a form of selflessness where we think that there's, again, the analogy that Jeffrey Hopkins uses is that there's like a head salesperson here that is in charge of the sales department. Kind of this idea that there's something that is among the aggregates, kind of a part of them, but still has somewhat an independent status. So when we think my body and my mind, that's generally the operating sense of self that we have, that there's some sort of owner here, somebody in charge that is, the head boss that's in overlooking our mind and our body. And this also doesn't exist. There is no self that exists in this way. But the lower schools, they will refute those, but they don't go on to say that the self doesn't have any inherent existence at all. They still point to something on the basis of the self that they can say is the real self, even though there isn't this substantially self-sufficient existent self, that is kind of standing on its own as the boss. You still can find something within all of that collection of stuff that is the person. And for most people, they point to some level of the consciousness or awareness that goes from life to life that becomes the basis of the person. And they say that must be the real self. And Prasangika says, no, there is no real self because that is a continuum of mental moments. That's not the self. We cannot find the real self existing inherently there either. So this is, again, these lower views. What was essentially said in those two lines I just shared was that people say, well, if that's all I need to realize, well, then why do I need to realize emptiness of inherent existence? It's not important. It's not necessary because those coarser views, when I refute those and realize those selflessnesses, then that's sufficient. And the response to that from Shantideva was, it is because it is taught in the scriptures that without this path, there is no enlightenment. Now, again, we're not just going to put all of it on scriptural sources. That's where it started. But obviously, where we've gone to from there is to look at the actual reasonings that support that. But they pointed to the scriptures as saying that this is the only way out. The only way out of samsara is to realize the emptiness of inherent existence. All those other realizations are stepping stones, but they don't actually get you out. They don't do the trick. Okay. So again, there was a lot more to that part of this going on through whatever verse 56, but nonetheless, skip over the rest of that and go right to the section that we're in now, explaining extensively the reasoning establishing emptiness. And we saw that that was once more divided into two parts, as I mentioned earlier, explaining the reasonings for the selflessness of persons and explaining extensively the reasoning establishing the selflessness of phenomena. And that's where we're going to begin tonight. Let's just look at the few verses that had to do with persons. As I mentioned, it's a very similar analysis to what we're going to do to start off this next section. So when we look at the basis for a person, we see it includes things like the teeth, hair, and nails. They are not the self. The self is not the bones or the blood. The mucus is not it, nor is the phlegm, nor is the lymph or pus. The self is not the fat or sweat. The lungs and liver are also not the self, nor are the other inner organs the self. The self is not the excrement or urine. Maybe we should be very glad of that. The flesh and skin are not the self. The warmth and winds are also not the self. The orifices are not the self. In all ways, the six primary consciousnesses are also not the self. So everything up to that point was in the form aggregate, all the various subtle and coarser forms that we have that are involved in the basis for a person. And then to go on to refute even the consciousnesses, our mental consciousness as well as the five sense consciousnesses, they are also not equivalent to this real self. We don't find anything on the basis for a person that is the real person. We're going to continue this exploration, as I said, when we go into the selflessness of phenomena. It's a similar type of thing. Well, can we find anything that is the real body, that is the real mind, that is the real feelings, the real phenomena in anything that we look at? And so again, this is just a little preview of what we're getting into, as well as a review of what we talked about in the last course. Are there any questions before I go full steam ahead through till close to the end, and then I'll open it up for questions again? Everybody's in the right place, I assume. Okay, good. All right, no questions. Okay. If you do have questions that come up again during the lecture, feel free to put them in the chat box. There will be a chance, of course, to ask questions at the end. I'm hoping have enough time for that. So let's go into phenomena. as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at explaining selflessness of phenomena in a variety of ways. The first one has to do with close placements of mindfulness, but let's look at this outlines on page 47 of Gyaltsep Je's commentary, which hopefully you have in front of you, explaining the selflessness of phenomena by way of the four close placements of mindfulness. And then, of course, we'll go into some additional things that follow from this. So I want to talk a little bit, first let me introduce these four. We see that these four are the next four outline headings underneath that. These are meditating on the close placement by mindfulness of the body, or of mindfulness of the body, sometimes called, and then of feelings, mind, and phenomena. So I want to introduce you to these four close placements of mindfulness. These are included often, let me take it off screen for just a moment. I did put up a little slide on this, but know that these are practiced in all Buddhist traditions, and they are relied upon very heavily in a lot of Theravadan traditions as a way of getting our heads around the Four Noble Truths. We'll talk about that shortly. But the idea is that these are part of what you often see as a grouping that you may have heard of called the 37 Harmonies with Enlightenment. They are a set of seven sets of things that are included, again, across all Buddhist traditions, whether you're a Hinayana practitioner that's practicing for your own liberation, a hearer or a solitary realizer. Remember, we've talked about those guys before. Or whether you're a Bodhisattva. All practitioners want to engage in some analysis of these four objects using what's called a close placement of mindfulness. It has an element of mindfulness to it, but it also has an element of wisdom, kind of investigating these phenomena. And these are to, again, enlarge upon the Four Noble Truths, as well as Bodhisattvas in particular use them to investigate emptiness of inherent existence. So you may see them in other contexts. This is definitely taught in the basic program course on Maitreya's Ornament, Chapter 4, where I'm going to be actually citing some of the things from the study manual for Maitreya's Ornament about them. So we do have definitions of each of the four that are in Gyaltsep Je's little commentary there, but let's go ahead and look at what's on the screen. This is from Jetsun Chokyi Gyaltsen's definition. The definition of a close placement of mindfulness is an exalted knower of one who has entered a path. I mean, ideally, when we talk about it in this context, it's someone who's entered the Hinayana or the Mahayana path. But we can still engage in this type of analysis without having entered the path through, genuine renunciation and bodhicitta. But the idea is this is an exalted knower or wisdom included within either mindfulness or wisdom. And we've discussed both of these factors before. I don't think we need to touch on them again. That meditates on the four bodies, feelings, minds, and phenomena through examining the specific characteristics as well as the general or shared characteristics of each of them. So we're going to go into that more right now. So there are four close placements of mindfulness on the body, feelings, minds, and phenomena, in which mindfulness repeatedly focuses on the thorough investigation of their specific and general characteristics. The specific characteristics of each object are, and we're not going to again touch on these in Shantideva's analysis, but I wanted to let you know about them at least, the impurity of the body, which, as I said, we've seen already in Shantideva's texts numerous times. The suffering nature of feelings. Again, feelings here isn't like the whole range of emotions. It's the feeling tone that we have at any particular time. It's an omnipresent mental factor. At any point in time, you are either feeling a pleasurable sensation or feeling tone, a painful one or unpleasant one, and finally a neutral one, which is where you're not feeling anything charged one way or the other. So we have three different types of feelings. They're all in the nature of suffering. Because as we see through the Four Noble Truths, that even our feelings of happiness that are together with these contaminated aggregates are a form of dukkha, a form of suffering. Then the third one, the impermanence of the mind. So we look at the impurity of the body, suffering nature of feelings, impermanence of the mind, the changing nature of the mind, and then finally the selflessness of phenomena, that all phenomena lack inherent existence, which is, again, how we would ideally want to look at this. Some of the lower schools might not necessarily look at the phenomena that way. So let's look at each of these individually just to gain an appreciation for how in that way they can become an entry point for one of the Four Noble Truths. So through the close placement of mindfulness on the body, one sees that the body is in the nature of pervasive compounded suffering. This is the subtlest form of suffering, or dukkha. Means pervasive. It pervades every existence we've ever had and every moment of every one of those existences. It's compounded or compounding in that it is built upon all the causes and conditions that simply we keep giving rise to again and again because we don't do anything to interrupt that causal process. From this, one generates a wish to be free from this suffering. In this way, one engages true sufferings. It's the first noble truth. When we begin to see the suffering nature of the body, how impure it is, how it's not a reliable support for us. It's decaying all the time. And then we engage in the knowledge of true sufferings. Secondly, through the close placement of mindfulness on feelings, one sees that feeling induces craving, which is a cause of suffering. This is the thing, is the feelings that we have, if they were just feelings, they'd be fine, but we get totally attached to having the pleasant ones, totally attached to avoiding the unpleasant ones, and we even have a subtle form of attachment with regard to the neutral ones, just wanting them to kind of be sustained in some, subtle way. From this, it says, one generates the wish to abandon craving. In this way, one engages true origins. The true causes of our suffering, even when the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths for the first turning of the wheel, he said, the cause of dukkha is craving. That was the most palpable cause. We have a deeper cause, obviously, in our ignorance, but nonetheless, this is what keeps us going from object to object. We crave and desire to have those pleasurable things and to avoid the unpleasant things. So feelings get us in trouble in that way. So this is an investigation of where does dukkha come from? What are the origins? Third, through the close placement of mindfulness on the mind, one realizes that the mind, which is free from a self, has the nature of being produced and ceasing momentarily. We've come to understand that fleeting nature of the mind. It doesn't stay the same for a single second. It just continues to change every single moment in a continuum of awareness. From this, one no longer fears that the self will be severed because of that continuity of mind. And one generates the wish to actualize cessations, to get rid of the garbage in the mind that isn't in the nature of the mind, that can be removed through continual practice and practicing the path. So in this way, you engage in the true cessations that you desire, that you are wanting to seek, because you see that there is a continuity to mind, and that mind continues on, and therefore we will have that sustained purity upon removing all of those faults in the mind. Number 4, through the close placement of mindfulness on phenomena, one realizes that all phenomena of the thoroughly afflicted class, which includes our suffering aggregates and so on, are to be abandoned, whereas those of the completely pure class, which are all the realizations and so on, are to be adopted. From this, one develops the wish to cultivate the paths. In this way, one engages true paths, the fourth noble truth. So again, this was just a brief introduction to these on the basis of how they are often taught as a method for engaging in the Four Noble Truths. By seeing their specific characteristics, they help us to see more clearly the suffering nature of things by seeing the impure body for what it is. And then that the origins of suffering by virtue of seeing the feelings and how our feelings trigger our craving and so on. And I'm not going to go through them all again, but essentially this is how they're traditionally used, and used certainly by those who are achieving or wanting to achieve their own liberation. Now, the shared characteristics that all four objects have in common is that they are impermanent, they are all dukkha, unsatisfactory in nature, they are all empty and selfless. And of course, empty and selfless, we saw those defined earlier when I was talking about those coarser views of a person, empty of this permanent, unitary, independent self, the Atman, and selfless in terms of the substantially existent self-sufficient self that we talked about earlier, that is also non-existent. But we can extend from that to also include the emptiness of inherent existence, which is how Prasangika Madhyamaka, our school that we're studying here, Consequence Middle Way School, how they interpret the subtlest view of selflessness. These four characteristics in turn relate to the first three of the four seals that distinguish the Buddha's teachings. I don't recall if I've introduced the four seals as part of this course. I certainly introduced them in a number of courses that I teach. But these are the four as His Holiness sets them out with Venerable Chodron in one of the books in their new series that they've been publishing for some time now. All conditioned phenomena are impermanent. They change moment by moment without ever remaining static. All polluted phenomena are unsatisfactory or suffering in nature. That is, they're under the influence of disturbing attitudes and polluted actions. These first two point to the nature of what we are dealing with, temporarily changing phenomena in the world around us. Everything that's conditioned, created by causes, is impermanent. It doesn't stay the same for a moment, always changing. And then that everything that is created through the force of our karma and delusions is unsatisfactory. It's dukkha. And then the last two of the four seals, all phenomena are empty and selfless. Again, those were the two that we talked about on the 2 slides ago. And by understanding these three seals, we come to realize that nirvana is peace. So these four seals, again, not going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on them, but they are what makes one a Buddhist philosophically. If you adhere to all conditioned things being impermanent, all contaminated phenomena being unsatisfactory, all phenomena being empty and selfless, and then nirvana being peace, that's how you would be a Buddhist philosophically. You're a Buddhist by practice if you take refuge and follow the teachings of the Buddha in that way. But in terms of philosophically, you have to sort of test and see, are you really adhering to all of those and practicing according to those? But those are essentially a hallmark. That's why it's called a seal. It sort of signifies that that particular tenet or philosophical system is Buddhist in nature. It's actually an interesting book. I can't remember the author. It's called something like, How Are You Not a Buddhist? And it's like, puts those four forward and says, if you're not really adhering to all these and living your life by them, you're really not a Buddhist. So anyway, I can't remember the exact title right now, but okay, so let's go to the Bodhisattva's way of working with these. I don't have too much more, and then we'll get into the verses. Bodhisattvas seek to realize the emptiness of inherent existence of the body, feelings, mind, phenomena, and of course, the person designated and dependence upon them, which is what we looked at previously in the last course, as well as to establish their conventional existence in that they exist by being merely designated by mind. Once more, the two truths. They want to establish the two truths with regard to all of these other phenomena besides the person, the body, our feelings, those mental factors, mind, which is the raw consciousness itself, the 6 consciousnesses, mental and 5 sense consciousnesses, phenomena, everything other than those, and often includes a lot of the other mental factors that are in the continuum of the person. All of these need to be established as lacking inherent existence. That's how Shantideva is going to approach the foreclosed placements of mindfulness, is to take it right to that most ultimate analysis. How do these things exist not conventionally, the impurity of the body and so on? How do they exist ultimately? And then establish them as merely designated, merely imputed by mind. Okay, so let's go into the body. For the body, there are 4 outlines. The first one, page 47 still, comprehending that possessing parts, the body as lacking inherent existence. So, verse 78, the body is not the feet or calves. The thighs and loins are also not the body. Neither are the abdomen and back the body. The chest and shoulders are not the body either. The ribs and hands are also not the body. The armpits and upper arms are also not the body. Even the inner organs are not it. The head and neck are also not the body. With regard to those, what is the body? Meaning kind of the real body. You know, if we go just looking in a really casual way without doing an ultimate analysis, we find bodies really easily. Oh, there's your body, there's my body. We don't really have to go looking very far. But if we go investigating again in an ultimate way, where's that real body? We think there's a real body here, but where is it? Can we find it on any of these parts? So this is what we're getting into with this investigation. Let's go ahead and start with Gyaltsab Je's commentary. It says, it follows the body does not exist inherently, Because if it existed inherently, then an example of the body should be findable, or a better word we often use in other studies is an illustration of the body, something that actually illustrates the body, that is what we find is the ultimate body. And this would be if somebody really adheres to inherent existence and thinks that you can find that. That's what we go looking for. And of course, we don't find it. What's the illustration of the body? What is it that we can point to that says, ah, there's the body? And what we're going to run into when we go into some of these analyses is we see that the body consists of a multiplicity, right? We have so many parts to the body. We can find infinite parts if we keep going down subtler and subtler into, molecules and atoms and subatomic particles and whatever, quarks and subquarks and whatever. And you can find that there are a zillion parts to the body, infinite parts to the body. Well, there's no unitary thing then that is the body. When we think body, we think one, right? You don't think you have two bodies, you have one body. Maybe nice to have two bodies. I could go take that one for a while if it's a nice, fresher, younger body than the one I have. But this is how we think of it. Well, then we have to find, if there is a true illustration of the body, we have to find one thing that is the body. Well, what's that one thing? Just like when we talked about the self, if we think that there's a unitary self here, because there is this sense of unitariness with regard to the self that we also adhere to in whatever form of ignorance is operative. We think there is a self. Well, then you have to find a referent of that, an illustration of that, that is identifiable as one thing. And of course, there we looked at the mind and the body, and we can go into more investigation into each of those. We never find anything that is the real I. Here, we never find anything that is the real body. So an argument is then put forward, and it says the collection of the accumulated parts is the body. It's kind of like a collection, the complex. Sometimes we call it, that when we talk about the basis for a person, the mind-body complex. We think about this collection or this a gathering of things. That's the body. Somebody's putting forward that argument. And what doubt is there about this, they say. So Madhyamaka, the middle way, replies, because one labels the body in dependence on the collection of the parts of the body is unsuitable to be the body. This is a point that's going to be brought in later as well. If you have something that is the basis for it, well, how can the basis for it be it when those are two different things? They have the label of mala. Well, let's stay with body. Maybe we should introduce other things. We're working with body here. So we have this idea of labeling this as body, and then we have the basis for the body. Well, if we really think about the consequences of this, if there was an inherently existent body on this basis, we wouldn't need to label it. It would be evident, it would be self-evident. As soon as this appeared to you, body would already be there. You'd never have to learn that it's body. You'd never have to give it that name. Bodiness would already be there, self-established. But we see that we have to give it a label. We have to call it something. Calling it something means that then the basis for calling that, it can't be it. Jeffrey Hopkins in his book, Emptiness Yoga, says, actually, if we contemplate this point and it doesn't kind of really get our goat, in a sense, kind of really help make us question things, then we're not thinking about it hard enough. The phenomenon that is labeled, such as body, and the basis for designation of body are two different phenomena. Related, absolutely, because body is a label we give to the basis for body. Basis for body is what receives the label. But the label and the basis are two different things. They're not equivalent at all. This is why things lack inherent existence as well, is because you cannot find a real body on the basis. Body, once more, merely designated, merely labeled to that. Let's continue on. So then it says, continuing, if it is not like this, then one needs to accept a final partless particle. You may wonder, well, how did that jump happen? How do we go from talking about the body to a final partless particle? Partless particles are talked about in some of the lower schools of Buddhist philosophy, where they say that you get, as you would by these scientists who are going down to microscopic and submicroscopic and whatever, all these minute levels, that at some point you get to what's called a partless particle. because they too recognize that everything is built up of something else. So they recognize that, the body has various parts, those parts have parts, those parts have parts, and so on. But they believe that there's something you can get to that you go, there it is. You peel the onion and you actually get to a core. You get to something that is the substance at the center of it all. Well, partless particles don't exist, and the logic for refuting them is going to come up very shortly. But just know that if an inherently existent body existed, if that actually was established, then it would have to have these partless parts. You would have to find something that has some sort of substantial existence as the basis for that. May not exist at the level of the hand or the head or whatever, but it exists at some level as a reliable foundation that you can point to, rather than this process that we go through that, again, I think unnerves a lot of people. But you keep peeling it away and you never find anything that's real. You say, okay, body, where's the real body? You go through all these parts, you can't find it. And then you go, well, where's the real head? And you go to the head and you can't find anything that's the real head. You just see all the parts of the head. And then you go, where's the real eye? Then you go to, where's the real pupil? And then you go to, you keep going down and down and down. And you never find anything that's real. Everything is merely labeled. There's a basis for it, but that basis doesn't have that identity at all. It's all merely designated. Okay, so next paragraph, page 47 still. Then, when one analyzes whether and how the basis of engagement for the label that expresses body exists from the side of the body itself, we see, just as this verse said, the feet and the calves of the person are not the body of the person. The thighs and buttocks are also not the body. And also the stomach and back are not the body, because the body of the person is labeled in dependence upon these. If the person's labeled in dependence upon those, they can't be the person. They're the basis for labeling person. They're not the person. Yeah. The chest and upper arms are also not the body. The rib cage and hands are also not the body. The armpits and shoulders are also not the body. And the internal organs are also not it. If also the head and neck are not the body, then which of these parts is the body? Not any of them. Again, body is merely labeled. Body exists, but you can't find the real body. You can't find anything that you go, there it is. Just like before with the self, you can't do that as well. You can't find something that you go, there's that real I existing in my mind or existing in my body or existing somewhere other than those. Next paragraph, it starts at the bottom of that page. Because also their collection is not the body, and also nothing of one or of different entity from these is the body of the person. Therefore, the body does not exist inherently. Again, it sounds kind of strange to say, can you find something that's other than the basis of the body that is the body, the real body? Like, is my real body like on the other side of the room over there? Do I find my real body to exist apart from the parts of the body? We did that for the self. It sounds kind of strange to think that there's something other than the parts that could be identifiable as the real body, because we think of the body so intertwined with these parts. It becomes, again, a label we give to it, but it covers all of this, from the top of our head down to the bottom of our toes and everything in between. Yeah. So let's go on then to the next section. We have a number of verses, and I'm going to break away from each of these to do the bit of commentary on them. I think it's kind of easier doing them that way, because these are all in the same outline, but they just kind of become quite a bit. And actually, I am going to be showing, I actually have some additional commentary to show you. I'm not going to rely on Gyaltsab J's for this section. I've done that on the previous occasions. I just found sometimes the wording in this translation isn't as clear as in other translations, at least to my mind. So verse 80 says, if this body were to abide with its parts in all of them, somehow abide with a part of the body in every part that exists, that full thing we call the whole, the body, exists partially in every part of the body. Although the parts abide in the parts, in what does that itself abide? So every part has additional parts. You're going to see this when we go through the commentary. So if I say that there's kind of a part of me or of the body that abides in my head, a part that abides in my chest, a part that abides in my arms, a part that abides in my legs, and so on, well, then every one of those parts I mentioned, they too have parts. So where does the arm abide? It abides in the parts of the arm, in the elbow, and the, forearm, and the upper arm, and, and so on. You end up with like this whole infinite regression occurring. So here I'm going to rely upon Minyak Kunsung Sonam's A Brilliant Torch, which again was the commentary. It's kind of hard to obtain, but it's a commentary that was used by His Holiness when he taught the book that we're using. So sometimes what His Holiness says reflects some of what this author says. So you might think then that the existence of the visible body made up of constituent parts is based on all its parts. In that case, you have two options, and this is what we're exploring first in verse 80, and then the second option we'll look at in 81. Does this visible partible body, it's kind of a strange term, divisible body would be another way to refer to it, whose existence is based on its parts, reside partially in all its parts, one part in the hands, another part in the feet, and so on? This is what we're going to look at first and what was in verse 80. Or, as is explored in verse 81, does the gross partible body reside entire in each single part, like the hands? Is there an entirety of the body in the hands? Each hand has a body residing within it? Or is a part of the body, this is the first option, existing in each of the individual parts? Yeah, because people you have to kind of think about these things and get into a deeper analysis, not just take it on the surface, but because we still believe there's a real body here, even with what we've already looked at in the first few verses. So let's look at that first option, which is what Shantideva is going into in verse 80. If it were the first case, then the parts of the gross partible body would indeed reside in the parts, such as the hands. So like a part of my body is in my hands, one part in each hand, one part in my head, and so on. But where do the parts themselves, like the hands, reside? We could never find where they reside because the parts like the hands themselves made up of parts would necessarily reside in their own fingers and the palm and whatever the thumb, all of these parts of the hand each have a part of the hand in them. We can continue with this sort of investigation down to the level of the tiniest particles. Well, then where is the parts, the whole finger? It resides in all the various parts of the finger, a part of it in each part. Everything resides with a part in each part. You don't have anything that has any, once more, substantial existence. Can't find something that is that whole thing we call a hand or a body or a head or whatever the case might be. Put another way, the parts of the body would indeed reside in each of the individual parts, but where would the partible body itself reside? I mean, in a way, we could say that sort of, our hands are a part of the body. So there is that kind of idea that they are part of that whole. But where is that divisible body? Where does that unitary thing that we call the body itself reside? Even though it can be divided into these various things, we have to find something that is that body. It is not possible to observe any other basis for its existence than its parts. We don't find, again, that it has any sort of substantial or self-established existence. It's always going to be involved with the parts of the body, which are multiple. Even though it's a unitary phenomenon, it exists together with that basis, which is a multiplicity. And any one of those things that we look at as unitary have their own multiplicity, and so on. It becomes just, again, infinite regress, always looking for something, and we never find the unitary thing that we are seeking. Now, verse 81, if the body in its entirety were to abide in the hands and so forth, this is that second option, then there would be as many bodies as there are hands and so forth. If we say there's a real body in its entirety, that whole partible or divisible body, like right there in each of the parts of the body, then sorry folks, but you have a zillion bodies, because every single part has an entirety of the body in it. This is kind of an absurd premise, but it still has to be explored. So here, Minyak Kunsam Sonam says, the second case is not acceptable either, because if the entire body, complete with all its parts, resided in each of the individual parts, such as the hands, there would be as many gross bodies as there are parts, like the hands and so on. And of course, because every part can be divided down into further parts, you never find an end to the number of bodies there would be, because every little part would be a body in its entirety. And we know this is absurd. We don't have to think too much about it. If a body does not exist in the outer or the inner, how would a body exist in the hands and so forth? If that different from the hands and so forth does not exist, how would it exist? So let's look at what he says on this again. I'm going to stay with this other commentary. He says, if one investigates with this sort of reasoning, there is no inherently existent body anywhere, either for the individual, which according to Buddhist theory is imputed extrinsically on the basis of the aggregates. In other words, it has its otherness of being different from the aggregates, as I was saying earlier, the I or the body that is imputed on the basis of these aggregates, nor for the intrinsic individual of non-Buddhist theories, which is permanent, single, and independent. Remember, this is the Atman that the non-Buddhist Vedic traditions are adhering to, and not related to the aggregates, that has its own autonomous, independent, completely independent existence. As this is the case, there is no inherently existent body in the hands or anywhere else. So we can't find this body for this extrinsically existent person that is posited by the middle way school, nor can we find it for the Buddhist, non-Buddhist theories of a permanent, partless, independent person. No way do we find a body that is inherently existent in any of the parts of the body, the hands or anywhere else. So they're just relating it to the individual who is involved with that body. These are interesting. Let me take it off screen for just a moment. When we talk about these four phenomena, if we relate them to the basis for a person, of course, body is the entire form aggregate. Feeling is the mental aggregate of feeling that is included in our mental awareness, sphere of mental activity, and it is one of the five aggregates as well. Then we have consciousness or mind, the third one, which is the larger bucket, which is the fifth aggregate of consciousness. And then we have in the fourth of these phenomena, as I said earlier, oftentimes when we analyze for the person, we see that that includes all the other mental factors. It includes our discrimination as well as our anger, our love, our compassion. All these various mental states are included in there. So we can see them also in terms of being the basis for a person. But when we look at this basis for a person that we call the body, that is the form aggregate, do we find it existing in reality, identical to anything that is a part of the basis for the body? Is it equivalent in all ways to the hands, to the head, to the heart, to any part of the body? And we see that it isn't. And of course, this is the investigation we're doing, whether we're investigating body or whether we're investigating the I, it's the same sort of thing of just trying to examine the basis for that and see if we can find anything that is the real fill in the blank, the real I, the real body, the real feeling, the real, and so on. This is what we're going to be looking at. And again, I'm not going to belabor some of these points because they do get repetitive and to some degree, and that it's the same type of analysis that we're going to be looking at for all four of these close placements. Furthermore, this is kind of an interesting little section. Furthermore, one should not think that the combination of parts, which is the basis of designation of the body, is the body. It is not. It is just labeled as a body. I mentioned this earlier, right? Again, the parts of the body cannot be the body. They're the basis of designation for the body, and as such, they cannot serve as the real phenomenon itself, because they serve as the basis for the imputation of body, the designation of body. So that basis of designation of the body cannot be equivalent to the body. It's just labeled as a body, just like the mala is just labeled as a mala. There's no real mala. There's no real anything. Nothing has any substantial existence, all merely labeled, merely designated. If the combination of different parts, which is the basis of designation of the body, were the body, then it would follow that everything from the combination of fingers, which is the basis of a hand, down to the aggregation of atoms would be the body. This is what we saw earlier, right? If we start saying that something is established as being the real body, then everything has to be the body. One of those consequences has to happen. Either it has some part of the body involved in it, or the body in its entirety is existing within each of those individual parts. So this is the problem. We have a multiplicity of things that are being designated a unitary phenomenon. That unitary phenomenon has to be a different phenomenon from the basis of designation. That is that multiplicity. These remarks on how we impute the body do not appear in the root texts, he says. They are explained in a commentary. So I included this because I thought this was really, a nice little summation of how things actually exist once more. In terms of their conventional nature, their conventional truth, everything is merely imputed, merely designated. It has nothing more than that. Our ignorant mind establishes things and believes in that reality of things existing from their own side, but our wisdom mind can know that that is not how they exist at all, and can still establish that they exist because they exist as mere imputations, mere designations. This is, in my estimation, again, I'm no great scholar, but this is really the foundation of Tsongkhapa's thinking in terms of how he approaches reality and examining reality. And so it's such an important thing to understand the two truths. We spent some time on those again in the last last course. And when you do, if you continue studying basic program, know that the text that's used to study the stages of the path, the middle length Lam Rim, there's just a new published commentary. It was the same translator who did the commentary previously that I've used when I've taught it, but it's now in a more finalized version, a much improved version in my estimation, that includes, why Lama Zopa chose that for the stages of the path course is because it includes a wonderful exposition on the two truths. And Rinpoche thought that was really important. So know that the two truths do come up in a number of ways. And if you study tenets, you also see that the two truths are discussed there in terms of each tenet system and so on. But very important, to have some grounding in how things actually exist. All right. So let's go on then. Where was I at? Back to the slides. That's where I don't want to jump back to the commentary yet. So let's go to, verse 83. Therefore, although the body does not exist, meaning inherently, this inherently existent body does not exist due to confusion regarding the hands and so forth, there would be a mind thinking of the body. It's because we are grasping at all these little bits as inherently existent. We also grasp the body as inherently existent. Like, due to the feature of being arranged in the shape, an awareness of a human being is produced with respect to a cairn of rocks or a scarecrow or whatever the case might be. We sometimes can impute a person being there on the basis of what's just the shape of a person. As long as the causes and conditions are there, such as holding the aggregates to inherently exist, then we believe the person to inherently exist. If we hold the parts of the body to inherently exist, the hands and so forth, then we hold the body to inherently exist. As long as the causes and conditions precede that, then we continue to have this ignorance operative. So here, Minyak Konsang Zonam says, if there is no independent body different from the limbs and so on, how can it exist inherently? Even when we look for what is called a body from the point of view of its basis of designation, we do not find anything, and neither does it exist as something different from this basis for designation. Again, this is repeating what we've already seen. So there is no inherently existent body. However, when people observe its basis for designation, such as the hands, because of the ignorance which assumes true existence in things, they believe that the body exists truly. It is like thinking a man-shaped scarecrow is a man, or again, a pile of rocks that we see from the distance on the horizon is a person. So as long as the conditions are assembled, Shantideva says, for that long, the body will appear as though it were a person. Likewise, as long as the hands and so forth exist, for that long will a body appear there. So as long as we are adhering to the inherent existence of the basis, we adhere to the inherent existence of what is labeled to that basis. It's, again, we have that misconception with all phenomena, down to whatever part. If we talk about the fingernail on our index finger, we think it's as inherently existent as the finger, our index finger, and that index finger as inherently existent as the hand that is the basis for all of the fingers and thumb and so on. So as long as we are adhering to the substratum of each of those, we, as inherently existent, we adhere to what is labeled as inherently existent. As long as the circumstances, poor visibility at dusk, heaped up stones, and so on are brought together, a scarecrow will be perceived as a man. This cairn of rocks, this pile of rocks, will be seen on the distance as being the human. Similarly, as long as there are assembled the contributory causes of hands and so forth appearing to be truly existent, the combination of the limbs will be perceived as a body. And as it is perceived, there will arise the belief that it is inherently existent. So it's, again, the false appearance is alluded to here that is contributing to all of this. As I mentioned earlier, this false appearance is included in what we call the knowledge obscurations. Once more, just to bring our memories back on that topic, which we talked about in the last course, we have the afflictive obscurations that we talked about earlier that are the ignorance and all of what's built on that ignorance. This creates a very subtle imprint in the mind. We've had this ignorance since beginningless time. It has produced a stain in our minds that causes things to appear as if they were real. Just like when we see a mirage and think it's real water, or when we see that pile of rocks in the distance and think it's a person. All of these false appearances, things appearing to be real, but they aren't. That's why it's so hard to break out of this, because everything appears to exist that way. We believe in it because it appears that way. But it's the same thing with our dreams. I always go back to dreams because it really is one of the most vivid ways for me to point out how we are making mistakes similarly. In our dream state, things appear to us as if, oh, there's a real person that we know from our life or whatever, or maybe somebody we don't know who's threatening us or whatever the case might be. We believe that that appearance is real in the way that it appears. It appears to our dream consciousness as real as the things in our waking life. Of course, there are differences again in our dream state. All sorts of strange stuff can happen that maybe doesn't happen in our daily life, our waking life. But it's the same idea. We have those appearances that seem to be real, and we adhere to them as if they were real. As long as those appearances are there, as long as we are still buying into those false appearances, we're just going to keep compounding our ignorance. We're never going to break free. We have to begin to question those appearances, as well as, of course, undermine the ignorance that believes in them. This is what we're doing and engaging in this type of study to continually chip away at this as best as we can. Now we go on to another section still within the body, and this is called, on page 49, Comprehending that the Parts Lack Inherent Existence. So here we're going to go down that one into the substratum for the body, and see, okay, what is the body based on, the basis for the body? It has parts. So similarly, because they are a collection of fingers, also, what would the hand be? Can we find a real hand, an inherently existent hand? Because they too are a collection of segments, by dividing the segments also into their parts, excuse me, the parts are also divided into particles. Those particles are also divided into directional parts. Because the directions too divided are free from parts, like space, therefore particles also do not exist. It's kind of taking it, as we already did to some degree in our minds in this two verses, taking it down layer by layer and say, okay, do we find anything that's real there? If we go beyond the hand to look at the fingers, and then from the finger down to the segments of the finger, the phalanges and what have you, and then we look at those, and we keep going down, we eventually get down into these tiny particles. They too are free, the directions are free from parts, so we do have to find that eventually we can't find anything that is partless, that has, any inherent parts to it, parts that exist from their own side. So let's look at what is said by Gyaltsep Je on this, again on 49. It says here, the body of the person is labeled in dependence on the collection of limbs and parts, and does not exist truly. Likewise, as the hand is also labeled in dependence on the collections of parts and fingers, how could it become something inherently existent? It is impossible, because as soon as we look for the real hand, we can't find it in any of the parts. We can't find in any of the individual parts, such as my index finger, a real index finger. In terms of any part of the index finger, such as my fingernail, we don't find it to be inherently existent, and so on. Also, because the finger is labeled in dependence on the collection of digits, it does not exist inherently. If the digits are also divided into their parts, they do not possess inherent existence. If the parts of the digits are divided into particles, then they also do not exist inherently. When the particles are also divided into different directions, directional parts, through the division into the directional part of the east and so on, then they are labeled in dependence on directional parts and do not exist inherently, because they also have a relative status in regard to what direction that they are in. Direction of the east side of that particle, the west side of that particle, and so on. East and so forth. Where did I leave off? Also, the directional parts do not exist inherently because they lack inherently existing parts. For example, like space. So in that way, we say they're sort of partless in that way. They don't have any inherently existent parts, because anything we get down to a minute particle, and as I said, I don't know where they're at with the status of all these things. I know they got to subquarks. I don't know if they've found something that's subquarks. It's kind of a part of a quark. But anything you establish as being a part, it has to have a relationship to other parts. And so there's got to be some directional part to it, because anything that is a part in the middle would have to have other parts that are surrounding it in order for it to be kind of, coming into some sort of a mass of particles. And so essentially, we have a directional part with relation to that particle that's in the middle. That's something to the east, something to the west, something to the north, something to the south, up and down, whatever. I mean, we have all of these various things that are directional. So while some of the lower schools adhere to this idea of partless particles, that you can get to a place where there's something that exists on its own without any parts. Well, Prasangika would always come and say, but there's still a part. There's a directional part here, a directional part there, and so on. So let's look at what it says, the rest of this. It says, then also the particles do not possess inherent existence, because if they did, then one would need to accept partless particles. But this is refuted by the reasoning of, if six are connected simultaneously. Let's look at this reasoning in the Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen's commentary, which I have quoted a number of times. There's an explanation of this with a footnote that goes into the actual text where they talk about this reasoning. The division into directions too are not established inherently, because they are free from inherently established parts, like space. I mean, there's sort of a space-like quality to it. You never find anything real. You keep going down lower and lower and lower, and you don't find, again, that sort of substantial thing at the core of anything that's physical. Therefore, particles also do not exist inherently. For if they do, one must assert partless particles, and that is damaged by reasonings, such as due to simultaneous conjunction with six. This line comes from a stanza in Vasubandhu's The 20, which states that, due to simultaneous conjunction with six particles, a particle has six parts. Also, if the six were in the same place, even a mass would be the size of a particle. So let's look at how this is explained. It's from Tupten Choki Dragpa's commentary. It explains, if such a center, minute particle, were to be surrounded simultaneously by six particles on the six directions, the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, above and below, then the center particle would either have parts touching all six directional particles, or it would not. All right, makes sense. You have something at the center and it's got those six around it, at least, above, below, north of it, south of it, east of it, west of it. Well, then the parts are touching those, or it's not. In the first case, since it would have six parts touching the six directional particles, this contradicts it being partless. In the second case, since all the particles would be in the same space, same place, it follows that even a conglomeration, that is the aggregation of many particles, would be the size of a minute particle. If you say that there's some sort of partless entity to it, and they're established all in the same space, then, because it can't have directional parts around it, well, then everything would be that. You wouldn't find anything beyond that. It's kind of an absurd consequence. But the reality is, we see nothing that is directionally partless. There always is a directional part, always something that is, again, to its left, its right, whatever, above it, below it. Okay, let's see if we can finish off this before we conclude tonight, just this section that concludes our looking at the mindfulness, close placement and mindfulness of the body. So this outline is called, then attachment to the dreamlike body lacking inherent existence is unsuitable. This is just 2 lines. Hence, which discerning one would be attached to dreamlike form? So on the top of page 50, Gyaltsep J says, this dreamlike form appears as something identifiable at the time of immediate investigation. But at the time of investigation, it does not exist inherently. Who that possesses discernment would be attached. It is unsuitable, as there is nobody that comprehends the object of true grasping. So again, it's just telling us, well, why should we be attached to this thing that we are finding is dreamlike, has no real substantial existence? I think this is the hardest thing, but if we really take our investigation to the conclusion that it's calling us to, we see that what we have been adhering to doesn't exist, but therefore there is nothing we can adhere to. It should undermine completely all of our grasping, all of our ignorance. It has to completely remove that, because the object of that doesn't exist at all. I mean, if we go back to the dream analogy, which again was referred to here, everything being dreamlike, if you are able to bring a lucid awareness into your dream state, then you know that when those really attractive things that are appearing, or the really fearful, frightening things that are appearing, that they aren't real in the way that they appear. You don't have those emotions. And I haven't done that much lucid dreaming, but the bits where I've been able to and have some awareness, oh, that's a dream object. That object isn't real in the way that it appears. Again, it's an analogy. It's not identical. I'm not saying that we are in a dream state, but we are in a state that is similar to a dream. It is dreamlike. And then that's the way it's dreamlike, because it appears to be real, but it doesn't have that at all. If we got that with regard to our waking existence, that things were not real in the way that they appeared, and we were undermining that ignorance in every moment, we wouldn't grasp at things. We wouldn't have all the problems we have. We wouldn't be engaging in unskillful karma based on this ignorance, because we wouldn't have that ignorance present. Again, we have to realize emptiness pretty profoundly before we can have that to the degree that it will actually affect us. But we keep working on it. So then the final one, this also establishes the person as lacking inherent existence. Although we've already investigated the person, we're going to kind of come back to the person again in these two lines. When, like that, the body does not exist, what is a man? What is a woman? What is a person of whatever gender, specified or non, is that person? This is also pointed out to some degree because, once more, we often have these attachments to these identities of the person that are based on the body so closely. This is how we mostly identify ourselves as well as others, is, with regard to the physical basis. So here I'm going to share Abbot Dr. Geltson's commentary, and then we'll close for tonight. When, like that, the body of a man does not exist inherently, what are inherently existent men? What are inherently existent women? There is no inherently existent person, just as there was no inherently existent body. Merely the refutation of a self-sufficient person by this text is not a fully qualified realization of selflessness of persons. Again, that was that subtler view of self of persons that I talked about earlier tonight, the self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Refuting that alone isn't a fully qualified realization of selflessness of persons. Again, we needed more than that to attain liberation, as was seen in that section that we went through in the last course. Continuing, he says, rather, one must realize the non-existence of a person who is not merely imputed by nominal convention. Anything more than being merely imputed by nominal convention does not exist. That's why we talk about the mere I and the mere person. That's the only way that person or I exists. We have to realize the non-existence of a person who's anything more than that, who is, not merely imputed, existing in a more substantial way. The two selflessnesses do not differ in ease or difficulty of realization. Now here we're talking about the two selflessnesses of person and phenomena. Since the bases, persons and aggregates, which is the main basis we're using here in looking at these close placements. Remember, I just talked about how the four close placement objects can be seen as the basis for a person, in other words, the aggregates. They do not differ in coarseness and subtlety of being substantially existent or imputedly existent, nor do they differ also in the attribute of coarseness and subtlety with respect to phenomena and the self that are the objects of refutation. Again, there's no difference in terms of kind of their mode of existence and what we are refuting. The only difference is the basis itself. You should understand that the dispute regarding whether or not hearer and solitary realizer superiors realize the selflessness of phenomena by taking the system of the infeasibility of them having the realization of the selflessness of persons to be just talk of those who have not fathomed it. So the idea here is that we should understand that anyone in any of the other Buddhist systems who purports that hearers and solitary realizers don't realize this selflessness of phenomena, that is the object that is realized by, according to the middle way system we're studying, their view is not correct. Anyone who wants to attain their liberation, their own individual liberation, or whether they want to attain enlightenment, they both have to realize the selflessness of persons and phenomena that is this final view, the lack of inherent existence of those things. Oops, that was it. Okay, we'll go on to feelings the next time. Okay, any final questions? We got just a few minutes and we can go a little over if you need to tonight. Any comments, questions? Is everybody feeling back in the groove? It took me a little while to get back in the groove on this, but doing okay. All right. Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, again, feel free if questions do come up between classes, you can send them to me or you can pass them along to any of the people coordinating this, and we'll be sure to address them or write them down and ask them in the next class. I will get around to hopefully the homework and meditation tomorrow. I am going to go back to preparing some meditations, I think, though. I got to find yeah, I don't know if there are any written meditations on these close placements of mindfulness, but they're really good to do, and maybe even incorporate also the coarser way of approaching the body, seeing, the impurity of the body in that, but not in a major way, but nonetheless to use these verses as much as possible to investigate the lack of inherent existence of the body. I know there's a wonderful little meditation that I've distributed on occasion around the dependent arising nature of the body that Venerable Robina did. That's kind of, I've got it in writing, that can be useful, but anyway, I'll make up my mind tomorrow. I've got some time before I get this out, but if I don't get things to Bonnie right away and they don't get posted, don't be surprised, just because I'm at my mom's, as I said, and I'm trying to care for her and do this as well as 2 more classes. I generally have 3 classes, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, during this month. And then sometimes I'm even teaching on the weekend a little, but nonetheless, they kind of stack up because there are 3 days in a row where I have to do all of this, bit of preparation. So I'm just asking your patience. So thank you. Let's go ahead and do a few prayers to dedicate. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel Bodhichitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. We do prayers for our precious teachers as we recite this for His Holiness as well as for Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Think that we're creating the causes as well for all of our other spiritual guides and all spiritual guides in whatever tradition, that they may continue to abide in this world to help beings who depend upon them to find a path that leads to true peace and happiness. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And lastly, dedicate for all those beings that you're holding in your heart right now, whoever it is that you know that is experiencing suffering, illness, obstacles, who's dying or who has died. Send this positive energy out to them. Give it all away with this kind of true spirit of compassion and concern for others so that they might know complete freedom from their suffering immediately, and also find all the causes that will lead them to true peace and complete happiness. And may all beings achieve that same result through what we've done here tonight. Yeah, I don't know if at the end of the other course I mentioned the schedule for this one, but we are kind of continuous through the beginning of October. October 11th, 18th, and 25th, those 3 Mondays, we won't be meeting. So there'll be a bit of a break in between. And that's because the 11th is a holiday. I think in New Mexico, we have it as Indigenous Peoples Day, but it's also known as Columbus Day in a lot of parts of the country. And then the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be on solitary retreat. So I won't be teaching from there. And so we'll resume in November, and I think there are 5 Mondays in November, and we'll have all 5 of those as teachings, and we'll be over by December if everything goes as planned. And that way you can take December off. Okay. Oh, thank you for putting those all in there. Great. Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Nate. All right. So again, be on the lookout for things getting posted there. Bonnie will get those from me when I'm able to round those things up. And I appreciate your patience once more. All right, everyone. Be well. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.